Hi, welcome everyone to the first event of the Trans Inclusivity Seminar Series, organized by Simon Liu, who is the IOE faculty LGBTQ+ equality lead, and a group of us academics working at the IOE and committed to LGBTQ justice, including transgender justice. I am Kata Kyrölä, Associate Professor in Media Studies at the IOE. My pronouns are they, them, and I will be chairing today's talk by Professor Deborah Shaw. In a minute, Simon will say a few more words about the seminar series. But before that, I'd like to just mention and thank a couple of people who have been so important for this initiative to become reality. Jane Flowers, who is the co-chair of the UCL Trans Staff Network. Thank you for your efforts in creating space at UCL for non-binary and transgender staff. And Gerard Jones, manager of the LGBTQ Equality Implementation Group, which funds this seminar series. Thank you so much for your support. And a quick note to the in-person participants about safety. In case of fire, please follow the event stewards to the nearest fire exit and assembly point. But without further ado, Simon will now say a few words about the seminar series. Please, Simon.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Kata, for myself as well as for our esteemed guests and our esteemed speaker today. As the Institute of Education's first and only appointed faculty LGBTQ+ equity lead, I have known that this position was hard fought for because it was to allow for much needed advocacy and equity work for our LGBTQ+ community within the IOE who deserve representation. But it was also for us being part of the LGBTQ+ community at UCL and beyond. Even long before I had the privilege to even apply for my current role, I knew from my Athena Swan work at the IOE as the intersectional LGBTQ+ lead that one of the first duties in service to the LGBTQ+ community was to address the widespread, horrific, and harmfully misleading narratives about the trans community, so painfully present in our everyday lives. In response, and in equally hopeful remedy to these narratives, this seminar series starting today was conceived of and planned out by a group of IOE staff and academics with myself, the Seminar Series Committee. We not only sought to try and stem the tides of these narratives, but to hopefully and ambitiously start to completely reverse them. It is with absolute delight, after months of collaboration with the Seminar Series Committee, cooperation with the IOE LGBTQ+ Advisory Group, ILAG, as well as the invaluable advice and guidance from consulting, administrative, and events planning staff, not forgetting support from senior members of the IOE and UCL, that I bring to you all the start of the first, but hopefully not only, Trans Inclusivity Seminar Series. This series will seek to platform the wonderful trans-inclusive work by brave and insightful academics, such as Professor Deborah Shaw, who will help us turn the tide.
Thank you so much, Simon. And we'll hear a few words from Alan Coker, Dr. Alan Coker, who is an elected member of the UCL Council and Associate Professor in Division Medicine.
Hi everyone, and thank you Simon and Kata, and thank you Simon for organising this series. It's really amazing and long overdue, and I think this kind of thing can get a lot of pushback, and I think you're really brave for taking it on, and it's really needed. I got involved more politically in the LGBT community when UCL wanted to leave Stonewall. I presented a paper at academic boards saying we should stay. I did a pretty bad job of it, I think, because we left. We lost the vote narrowly and we left. But I think this seminar series can invigorate us to campaign to rejoin Stonewall, as UCL should do. UCL was the first university in the UK to join Stonewall. Since that vote, and it was motivated by the gender critical ideology, nearly slipped up there. Since that vote, we've had instances of trans hate across UCL. Some of you may have seen stickers in female toilets stating, 99% of men are rapists and trans women are men. It's just horrible. The worst thing I've heard about that since is that some of these stickers are starting to get razor blades put underneath them. So if you do see them, the simple tip is to peel them off with a key. Don't use your fingers. I'm also a health and safety rep, so that's my health and safety tip. I'll leave it there because we've got a busy schedule. Thank you, Kat.
Thank you, Alan. Your support means so much to us. And next, we'll hear a few words from Alison Kozlowski, who is UCL's Pro-Provost of Equity and Inclusion.
Yeah. So, well, welcome. Good morning, everybody. First of all, a big thank you to everybody involved in organising this event today and to get the seminar series in its entirety. So that's really very exciting. My name's Alison Kozlowski. I've got several roles at UCL. I'm Professor of Social Policy and Co-Director of the Thomas Coram Research Unit, which is also in the IOE. There's a lot of IOE representation here this morning. But I'm here today, as Katja said, with my capacity Pro-Provost Equity and Inclusion at UCL, which means I'm the Senior Academic Champion for EDI at UCL. So I've been in post since September last year, so just a few months now. And I've really been exhilarated by the vibrancy of our EDI community, as exemplified, I think, Simon, by yourself here. The sheer amount of EDI activity across UCL in faculties and departments, as well across central functions, and of course our fabulous EDI team, which I know Gerard was part of for a little while. It's really breathtaking. UCL is an extraordinary place to work and to study, with its global reach and its fantastically diverse community. I'm just going to perch on the table here. If he doesn't move, all right. We know that being a diverse community is not always easy, but the intercultural riches on offer are one of the greatest gifts to us all. UCL has long been proud to be a radically different university with a tradition of challenging prejudice head-on and being a trailblazer in the dismantling of barriers to participation in its community. And this seminar series is certainly playing its part in this mission. So a very warm welcome from me to you all. Very warm welcome to Deborah. And without further ado, I'm going to hand back to Katja.
Thanks so much, Alison. Your support also means so much to us. So now it is finally my great pleasure to introduce today's esteemed speaker, Professor Deborah Shaw, who is Professor of Film and Screen Studies at the University of Portsmouth. Her research interests include transnational film theory, Latin American cinema, film and migration, and gender and sexuality in film and television. She's the founding co-editor of the journal Transnational Screens, one which I read regularly. And she is the author and editor of several books, perhaps too many to name, but let's name a couple. So her books include Contemporary Latin American Cinema, 10 Key Films, and Latin American Women Filmmakers, Production Politics, Poetics. Deborah is a great example of a public feminist intellectual as well, having written also popular articles for The Independent, The Conversation, Huffington Post, and Pink News, among other news and discussion outlets. Perhaps most relevant, however, for today's topic is the book Deborah co-edited on the iconic TV series Sense8 by Lana and Lily Wachowski, and the work she has done on issues such as the transnational feminist Me Too movement and the rift between trans-inclusive feminism and gender-critical feminism, which we will hear more about today. But before I let Deborah take the floor, I would also like to extend a welcome to our online participants. Please note that online participants, as well as people in the room here, you can send your questions through to us on Slido. That is slido.com, SLIDO.com. And please use the code #translove. So that is slido.com, #translove. So people in the room, of course, you'll be able to just raise your hand and ask questions after the talk. But if you wish to submit your questions anonymously, you can also use Slido. Now, please join me in welcoming Deborah Shaw.
Thank you. Thank you. It's funny, walking up makes me think I've won a prize, but in a way I have won a prize. And maybe Simon could just help me bring up the PowerPoint, or do I just do? There we go, all fine. Slideshow. Yeah, so before I start, I just want to thank Simon and Kata for the invitation. As they were talking, I was thinking of words kept popping into my mind of terror, but also privilege, honor, responsibility. And I'm going to try and take those very seriously. But it does feel like a real privilege and honor to be invited as part of such an important seminar series. So genuine thank you so much for the invitation. Really appreciate it. Okay, let's get straight onto the talk. So in this talk, I mean, I'll just stick to the script and I'll move away when I feel comfortable. I discuss from a trans-inclusive point of view the media treatment of gender-critical feminists with a focus on university culture. It's such a big topic and there's so much to say, so my focus really will be on media coverage. And I'm going to talk about media coverage in the centrist and right-wing press, and then contrast to a degree with the media coverage in film and television streaming series. Huge topic, so it will be surface in some parts. So I also examine the way the concepts of debate have been weaponized in large parts of the British media. And I contrast, and the focus is broadly on the UK with some television and film production from the US as well. I contrast the relentless attacks in the right-wing news media on trans women in particular as recipients of most trans-hostile coverage with new and more ethical representations of trans people in film and television. And I've just put some representations because it's not all rosy. I draw from an article I wrote, but I'm going to try not to reproduce it. Some of you may have read it. It's an open access article, and it's probably, in fact, it is the reason I was invited to give the talk. So I draw from this article in Women's History Review. So just to reflect on, and I'm going to reflect a little bit on the article and what I was trying to do before moving on to some new research as well. So my aim in the article, and I was very aware of this because I was looking at the case of Kathleen Stock in the media and the media coverage. And I really, again, that sense of responsibility, I was very conscious that I didn't want to make it a kind of personal attack or to be vitriolic. And I was very aware of some genuine threats and death threats against Professor Stock. And I made every effort to call that out because I don't think that's acceptable. So, I was thinking in a way, often debates about feminism get cast as woman against woman, and I really didn't want to be part of that. It was more about the discourse and the media coverage that I was trying to focus on. So in that vein, I considered Professor Stock as a totemic figure for a trans-hostile media, and I discussed the way her case was used to spread misinformation around universities and trans people, the way it was kind of co-opted to attack universities in the so-called closing down of free speech and debate. And I tried to interrogate that and push back on on some of that discourse. I've said that. Yeah, and I've said that as well. So one of the main findings was really the national platform given to Stock as a gender critical feminist, but not to trans people and trans inclusive feminists. And I challenge the impression given in large parts of the media that gender critical feminists are speaking for all women and all feminists. You know, particularly in the early days before the important pushback that Simon was talking about, it was very much about trans women versus women and versus feminists. And it was a very kind of lazy form of journalism when we do know that most, and against lesbians, we do know that most lesbians are trans inclusive. We know that most feminists are also trans inclusive. So it was a pushback from that shorthand, which was erroneous and is erroneous. So I'm going to do a kind of very short potted history of some key beliefs of gender critical feminism. As I say, it will be very surface, and there will be gender critical feminists who probably will disagree with this and say that they have, you know, there are fights within gender critical feminism. Not everyone thinks the same, but I'm going to give this kind of surface overview. So in the UK and the US, trans inclusive and gender critical feminists hold positions that are increasingly polarized. Very broadly, gender critical feminists seek to exclude trans women from the category woman, and they advocate for single-sex spaces that would exclude trans women. They argue that the term TERF, trans exclusionary radical feminist, is a derogatory slur, in part due to its use by opponents on social media. So in the article, I didn't refer to gender critical feminists as TERFs because I wanted to respect their right to self-define. There was a kind of little joke there. I don't know if people who read it got that joke, but I kind of made it. So they prefer the term gender critical, and I've seen on Twitter, X, that there's been recent discussions among some on social media to reterm themselves sex realists, and that's an ongoing discussion which I won't get involved with. Okay. So in the words of Kathleen Stock, gender critical academics emphasize the immutability and explanatory importance of sex, and gender critical feminists prefer to, I'm sure most of you know all this, but anyway, prefer to categorize humans by notions of binary sex rather than gender. Trans-inclusive feminists, on the other hand, see no difficulty in reconciling, and again, this is a very surface, but I wanted to kind of present the overview. They see no difficulty in reconciling a commitment to feminism with a commitment to the rights of trans people. They take the view, or we take the view, that trans women are women, and that as such, they are part of the constituency that is feminism's primary concern. They also have the kind of sense of solidarity with an oppressed group in a kind of intersectional take of feminism. And I drew from this, I drew from an article that I felt expressed this trans-inclusive feminism particularly well, and I put the notes there. The reason I drew from Finlayson, Jenkins and Woolsdale was because they were feminists, because they were philosophers. So I was sort of looking at Kathleen Stock as the kind of media visible philosophy professor, and I kind of wanted to show that within her discipline, that was a minority view, and most academic philosophers were trans-inclusive. You wouldn't necessarily know that from watching the media coverage, and that's the point I'll come on to. So trans-inclusive feminism, still, I would say, despite some pushback, is dominant in UK academia and traces its origins from the emphasis on intersectionality in Black feminism and its influence on inclusivity for third and fourth wave feminism. And I was kind of interested, and this could be a whole other topic here, that of the position of the academic in an institution where we are bound sounds negative, but we have a contract, I don't mean it to, we have a contract with equality, diversity and inclusion policies of our institutions. So in a sense, it is particularly difficult for gender critical feminists to have a dominant voice because I would argue their beliefs run counter to EDI policies. So there's a tension here, and it's an ongoing tension, as we've seen in some high-profile court cases that I'll come on to in a minute. But there are a number of high-profile gender-critical feminists in academia who have, I would say, sought and also received a disproportionate amount of media attention. And I'll come on to give some examples of that. Listen, we're not going to read Portsmouth's gender identity and expression policy, even though I did, but I thought it was important to just kind of put in, print what the policies are. I'll leave it there for you to read some of it, but our policies are very inclusive. So they talk about the Equality Act and how we're bound by the Equality Act, but we also wish to go beyond this and acknowledge and recognise the rights of people who see gender as a spectrum and who may express themselves in ways which are not typically associated with their biological sex they were assigned at birth. Mentioned non-binary, non-gender, etc. There's a whole section on terminology, and then probably more importantly, there's very clear guidance on how to, as staff, how to support trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming students. It gives us the steps to take. And misgendering is not part of our EDI policies. So this is where the rights of protected beliefs comes into tension with EDI policies. UCL, again, not going to read the whole thing, but I did read it. And there's also very supportive and practical guidance on how to support trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming students as well. That you can see that. I was going to say, I'm sure you've read it, but I hadn't ever read Portsmouth until I started writing this. So, but they're there. These documents are there. This is interesting, the last point, and I won't go into it, but it struck me that UCL would take action against any staff or student or staff member who bullies, harasses, or discriminates against a staff student. So that's, I won't say any more, but it's there. So I'm going to talk not exclusively, but a little bit about the Kathleen Stock. You can read the article if you want to know more about, obviously it's my partisan take, and I was very clear that it was written for the Women's History Review, and it was written as a viewpoint. So what I was asked to do was, what the brief is not to present the usual kind of neutral tone. It's a viewpoint, and it's asking for a partisan view. And the editor invited people with a different partisan view to respond. I don't know if they have. I don't think they have. Anyway, let's get to this, or I'll be talking for 3 days. So the UK media has focused on her gender-critical views, protests by students at her institution, Sussex University, the lack of staff support, and accusations of bullying, and her subsequent resignation. There's a kind of plot, there's a story. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. What's extraordinary is it's a single story retold many, many times from one point of view. So obviously for the research for the article, I read the same article hundreds of times in different newspapers, and it was the same article. So the case is featured in multiple stories in the centre-right and right-wing British press, including the Times, Daily Telegraph, Daily Mail, and the Express, all of whom are uncritically sympathetic to her. She's also provided her version of events on BBC Woman's Hour, BBC World Service's Hard Talk, and the person that gave her the hardest time was Lorraine on ITV, but she was on Lorraine. She also featured in the Channel 4 documentary Gender Wars that some of you may have seen. And what I found interesting about this was that a number of trans contributors to that programme criticised the documentary, and they alleged that they were misinformed about the nature of the programme, and they hadn't realised that Professor Stock would be centred. So there was a kind of pushback. Had I known, I wouldn't have been on it. Having said that, at least their voices were represented. And this, I guess, is the key to my problem. If an academic has a case or believes they have a case of discrimination and they're given media coverage, my issue with this was the lack of other voices, that there was a single voice in a discussion that's framed in a way that universities do not allow debate and discussion. So there was a paradox here that someone who was supposedly forced to resign for a lack of free speech, debate and discussion, the way the story was framed was one note, one tone, without any debate and discussion. So we didn't hear in any of these outlets from feminists with concerns that gender-critical academic feminism is discriminatory. We didn't hear from trans and non-binary people. We didn't hear why they would be uncomfortable with Professor Stock's views. We didn't hear why they were protesting. The Daily Telegraph cast them as a mob, a frothing at the mouth. They actually used those terms. But we didn't hear from that, inverted commas, mob. Why might trans and non-binary students feel uncomfortable with those who challenge their reality, lived experience, who talk of the dangers of trans-inclusive spaces, who cast a community in terms of danger, who seek the media spotlight for their views? So I argued that, I don't know if yes, I think I did argue, but I'm thinking about it more now, that it was cast about as repressing debate while at the same time repressing debate and discussion. And I was kind of thinking, there's so many amazing feminist philosophers, thinkers, critical thinkers. And this isn't about saying Kathleen Stock is rubbish. This is about you are one voice. Where are all these feminists who we've heard from for years, who are much higher profile, who are incredibly articulate? Why weren't they on Lorraine or Gender Wars or Woman's Hour? So you could argue, without going down a kind of conspiracy theorist paranoid, or maybe with going down a paranoid lens, that the media is very largely silencing trans-inclusive voices. And my point with this list is there are some amazing trans-inclusive voices. These are cis lesbian, not lesbian, sorry, interesting slip, some of them maybe. These are cis feminists. Sara Ahmed has written a fantastic essay, Gender Critical equals Gender Conservative. Where was she in the discussion? Alice McKinnon, incredibly high profile, foundational figure in the feminist movement, who wrote an essay, A Feminist Defense of Transgender Sex Equality Rights. Gloria Steinem, for fuck's sake. I mean, the ultimate, very famous feminist. More famous than Kathleen Stock. Why wasn't she invited to give these talks? Alison Phipps, there's another story there with Alison Phipps that I wrote about in the article as a kind of antagonist in this framing of the Kathleen Stock story. But if she's cast as an antagonist, why don't we hear from her? Not that she's not speaking, but the media isn't giving her that platform. The only outlet that gave her a platform was Pink News, which is a community newspaper. And then, of course, we've got some very high-profile trans or gender non-conforming authors that are really articulate, can explain this. And this is why I wanted to put their names here, because they know more than I do. They've got such a background in sex, gender, trans studies, and they could have given a very, very articulate pushback, not attacking in personal terms, but discussing these ideas. They were completely absent. So the names that you see there. So I argued that Stock's case has fitted neatly into pre-existing trans-hostile central right-wing media narratives seeking free speech martyrs, and has been weaponized by those seeking to attack trans people and universities. And we are tied very closely together because it has been used in an attack on universities and a lack of free speech. I looked at some articles with I focused on the Daily Telegraph as what I argued the newspaper most aligned with the Conservative government and its transphobia, basically. So just to look more generally at media coverage, some of these stats were in the article. The UK is, from an evidence-based point of view, a trans-hostile media climate. Jay Prosser has argued that since 2009, there was a 400% increase in reporting on trans issues accompanied by increased hostility in the media towards transgender people. That was in 2022, an article published in 2022, and it's only got worse, as I'll show. Sean Fay's research in the transgender issue was cited in a CNN report on the UK as one of the most trans-hostile media countries. So we're being noticed from outside as this is something specific to the UK, that we are becoming known for our media transphobia. They cited her article that in 2020, the Times and the Sunday Times published over 300 articles on the subject of trans identity, almost one a day. It's kind of a weird compulsion. We'll have to see what's going on there. And they were all negative. There was an article in Pink News by Elle Folan, and this was interesting, and this looks at the rise from 2016. So what they did in the article was to go to look at the first month of every year and to trace the coverage of trans identity or trans news stories. And we can see a massive rise. And they looked at the first month of the year, so January. So we go from 22 stories in 2016 to 115 stories in 1 month in the Daily Mail. And we also look at the rise of negative. So red is the negative stories. And they also looked at the Daily Telegraph, which we have, it's kind of interesting. And I was thinking about why this is. So from 2016, we have 10 stories and vast majority of them are positive. Then we kind of shift, something happens, 2020, 2022, suddenly 2023. So there's a reason for this. I'm watching, I don't know if any of you are watching True Detective at the moment, but the Jodie Foster character keeps saying, ask the question, ask the question. So I was thinking on the train today, ask the question. Why? I don't have the answer necessarily, but the question's a really important one. There's probably a term for this, but this is an extreme ideology and what's behind it. 2016, maybe there's a link with Brexit, things going wrong, we need to find scapegoats. Maybe there's a link with COVID, people online, I don't know. Maybe we can talk about that in the discussion, but we can see that there's been a massive growth in negative stories. So just to summarize, because I'm probably going over time, I'm just summarizing the key arguments. Gender critical feminists have been marginalized in academia, but very much celebrated by trans-hostile UK media. I tried to correct the framing of the stories of fight between feminists and trans people, particularly trans women. I looked at the negation of the existence of trans-inclusive feminists and academics and lesbians and the partial erasure of trans men in the absence, and certainly erasure of non-binary people as well. And I also spent quite a lot of time, and if I've got time, I'll look at this a little bit now, critiquing the way that trans women cast as a problem and a danger, compromising the safety of women. It's funny, just on an anecdotal level, my mum was saying to me yesterday, why are you so interested in this? Why do you keep wanting to write about this? And I think on a personal level, partly it comes back to my own experience as a lesbian, growing up in the 70s and 80s and Clause 28, and my sense of being fearful of being with a female student because the media had told me I was a predator and I was dangerous. And I kind of, the other people have made this point very well, but I think it's this sense of people are telling you who you are and it's all bad and it's all negative and it doesn't correlate with your own experience of your identity, but you internalize some of that. And I think, I don't know why I care so much, but I think that there's a personal element of this. So you might say to me, okay, you're exaggerating. A lot of gender critical feminists have said they're not transphobic, and I just had one quote in the article, which I found very difficult. Stock's argument is that, one of her key arguments is that trans women are basically living immersed in a fiction. The same as playing games or watching a television, it's not real. And that if we take this fiction to its logical conclusion, this is what we end up with. Unhappily infertile young adults, women prisoners made to share facilities with male rapists, sports women crowded out of competition by men they can't hope to be, young lesbians guilted into dating males, wives being coerced into participation in the cross-dressing fantasies of their husbands. I think I described this in the article as a kind of trans panic greatest hits, that it's you know, it's you know, it's all negative. And, you know, when you're writing about this, you're in a very difficult position because you kind of don't want to go there. You don't want to say, no, they're not rapists, and this is why they're not rapists. You almost think, why would I engage with this kind of predatory, transphobic fantasies? However, I did a little bit, just because, well, I'll get to that in a minute. But as I was rewriting this, or redoing this for this talk, I was reading some of Sara Ahmed's work. So yeah, just to summarize, so we have trans women who are cast as predatory, deceptive, and delusional men. And that's expressed as a moral panic and entirely in negative terms. And I was reading some of Sara Ahmed's recent work and the way she talks about stranger danger, and the way trans women are framed in terms of stranger danger. So we kind of know that she writes about some of the language used that correlates with the idea of stranger danger, such as gender extremism, the trans lobby, or even the trans Taliban. And then she describes transphobia, where trans people are constructed as dangerous, as those to be feared. I think that was something that I really wanted to tackle, that idea of people to be feared. And probably, as I said, because that you do internalize that to a certain degree. And then, of course, this tied in with my work in film and media, and I teach a Netflix documentary called Disclosure. If I've got time, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But Disclosure is very interesting for those that haven't seen it. It's basically, it does my work as a film studies lecturer for me. It has trans creatives who you know, quite high profile, who reflect on seeing representations of trans people in the media, and they discuss how it affected them. So it's kind of a very personal take on trans representations, as well as a history of trans representations, predominantly in Hollywood media. But, you know, if Stock is saying trans people are essentially a fiction, let's see if I can follow this through. I argued that her view of trans people as a fiction is a fiction because it doesn't correlate to lived experience. But then there's also a fiction of trans people that's been dominant in the media over time, which is only now starting to change, in which thrillers have coded trans women in particular as deviant, violent murderers. And the Netflix documentary Disclosure traces that extremely well. So we have Psycho, these are some of the most obvious examples, Dressed to Kill, Silence of the Lambs. And I'm probably not going to go, you know, just for time, I don't really want to do this. This is when I said, do we go into the kind of, no, they're not. But I do know a trans woman in Portsmouth, and she gave me some really good data about prisons. And I just thought, listen, I'm going to include it because that's a big topic at the moment, the terror of trans women in prisons. So just doing some surface research, the vast majority of trans women are held in the male estate. And of course, that makes them extremely vulnerable. So why are we not talking about the vulnerability of trans women being held in the male estate? The total number of trans victims far exceeds the number who were suspected of carrying out sex attacks. There was one case in 2019. So more than anything, trans women are attacked. I always come back to a quote by Lily Wachowski, who says about trans women, we're not predators, we're prey. And I think that's, you know, the dominant story that we're not hearing. Crime stats, you know, there is a cause and effect between trans hostile media climate. Data showed in a government report, so this is not, you know, some random report, that trans people were twice as likely to be victim of crime in England in 2020. Over half of trans people reported being fearful of leaving their home. So when we talk about debates and discussion, we have to think about the framing. Why are we not talking about that? Why are we talking about the supposed danger that trans people present rather than the danger that they experience, which is much more prevalent? So, as you will know, and I'm not going to talk about this in great detail, the case, we've recently seen the case of Professor Joe Phoenix, who won a discrimination employment tribunal against the Open University, finding that the Open University failed to protect her from harassment. It would be another whole paper getting into the rights and wrongs of that case. But I was interested in the way in which the story again was framed and the sense of we have a media playbook. We have, okay, here's another case, here's another Kathleen Stock, this is how we're going to tell this story. And lo and behold, I looked on Nexus Uni, the case only happened a week or so ago. There were already 1,182 articles about her case, and they were all supportive, and there was only one story being told. Professor hounded out over gender row. Just a few examples, a story in The Observer by Sonia Soda. We have the Daily Telegraph story. And then she was on GB News, and there's a lot to say there as well, and I actually watched it. You know, never in my youth did I think that this kind of far-right xenophobic television channel would be profiling left-wing feminists, lesbians. Very weird. Anyway, there's a story. I mean, and I guess the thing to say is, people aren't stupid. They're clearly being co-opted into a narrative. And I would say to gender critical feminists, think about the narrative that you're being co-opted into. Think about your bedfellows. Anyway. Joe Phoenix will say she's not transphobic, and I'm not going to get into that. But this was trending on the day in which she won her case. So I just used this on Twitter in order to show that gender critical feminists are being co-opted into a transphobic narrative. Trans women are comment. I don't think we can really discuss whether it's transphobic. It's objectively transphobic. That was trending on that day. You could argue can't determine what's trending, but that's the narrative that they're being co-opted into. That's just a repeat slide from what I said before, because it's the same case. Whose stories are we not hearing? One thing that, again, in terms of the media and legal cases, you may have heard of the organisation campaign group Sex Matters, founded by Maya Forstater. And they've identified at least 19 cases of gender-critical people and their rights being undermined in the workplace. I found this quote very interesting. Lucy Lewis, a partner at the law firm Lewis Silkin, noted, the media attention afforded to gender-critical cases perhaps suggested that they were more common than they really were. In fact, she suggested there were more likely to be a greater number of claims brought by transgender people alleging harm, though many go unreported. So, my interest here is in media coverage. So a narrative is being told to us, and we're not hearing stories. So any stories of trans people being discriminated at work, it's not making the Daily Telegraph or the Daily Mail, but it's happening. So the question of debate. As I said, the attack in the right-wing media is that academics are frightened of debate and frightened of discussion. Trans-inclusive people and trans people, object to the way the debate has been framed or the complexity of the question of debate. If you shout at an MP, do you know what a woman is? It's not a debate, it's a trap. So, let's think about our idea of debate. As Sean Fay argues, the media and the gender-critical feminists want to set the terms of the debate. It turns out that when the media want to talk about trans issues, it means they want to talk about their issues with us, not the challenges facing us. I like this quote very much. Sarah Ahmed in a blog says there cannot be dialogue when some at the table are in effect or intent arguing for the elimination of others at the table. When you have dialogue or debate with those who wish to eliminate you from the conversation because they do not recognize what is necessary for your survival, or because they don't even think your existence is possible, then dialogue and debate become another technique of elimination. A refusal to have some dialogues and some debates can thus be a key tactic for survival. Whose debate? Sara Ahmed again. This is how opening a debate in certain terms can be how some are shut out. Of course, we shouldn't enter a debate in those terms. And I talked about that in the article as well. It's like, isn't it a little bit offensive to expect a discussion with people that are calling you a predator or a fantasist or expressing your identity in terms of stranger danger? So, I've got a colleague at Portsmouth who works on Northern Ireland peace process, and I've spoken to him quite a lot. And I found something he said really stuck with me, which is when you are engaging in debate, discussion between Protestant and Catholic groups, nationalists and unionists, the first thing you have to do is have a discussion about the discussion. You have to have talks about the talks. And I think we are not in a position at the moment to have talks with such polarizing views. Perhaps we're in a position to have talks about talks, but we're not in a position to talk. Sorry, you could tell I was just reading Sara Ahmed and going, yes, yes, yes. So again, in her debate, she was saying, it's an article on gender critical and gender conservative. On some handles, talking about Twitter X, you'll find utterances like sex not gender or sex is real. And she talks about gender critical's disregard of the history, long history of feminist work on sex and gender that has been going on by people who know a lot more than I do. And she says, if trans people are associated with gender and gender is treated as immaterial, trans people or trans identities become immaterial. All you need to put on your handle is sex is real to indicate an attachment or an allegiance to a series of positions that do not have to be made explicit. Being trans is ideology, not science, feeling, not fact, immaterial, not material, subjective, not objective. And this is the key line. The terms themselves can end up doing this work of delegitimating or derealizing people. And I was kind of thinking as I was reading this about when we talk about accents, oh, he's got an accent, she's got an accent. Everyone has an accent. Everyone has a gender. Everyone has a sex. Sex is real. Gender's real. I don't know any trans-inclusive people who argue that sex isn't real. That is also a fantasy, I think. But you can have a gender that's gender conforming with what your society expects of you at any given moment in time. I quite often think about an old photo we've got of my grandfather where he's wearing a pink dress. That was gender conforming in whenever it was that he was wearing his pink dress. Everyone has a gender, every society. Anyway, I don't need to tell you this. No. So stories, this is where I get to the second part, and I'm probably gone on for far too long already. Am I okay? Okay. So, and this is where I was thinking about combining these two elements of my work, the kind of work on this, media and then my film media work. And I was thinking that there's a paradox with stories. So when communities or people are faced with ascribed unreality, if we follow some of the gender critical argument, if we follow Ahmed's view that you're not really real, you're really a man, you're really a woman, this is your reality. Trans identity is rendered real through screen mediations. So we need fiction or documentary to create the framework to tell the story for people to become real. Stories have the potential to approximate reality for trans people and counter misrepresentations, particularly when trans creative have access to telling their own stories. And I wanted to put this as a bracket. This isn't because they're not real, but because all screen representations are a mediation. So you kind of use the mediation to sort of create your reality. And I'm going to talk a little bit about disclosure that I've mentioned, and also, if I've got time, Know Me, Jamie Clayton, and Sensei. So I just wanted to do some framing questions. Who's telling the stories when we talk about film and media? Because this is a whole big discussion. We could talk about the Danish Girl and casting, and I'm not going to go into all that. So these are just some important questions to think about. Who's telling the stories? How are they framed? Are you talking about us, or to us, or against us? And you're too often talking about us when we are not in the room. And then I was thinking, am I allowed to put myself as an us? What do I mean by us? And I was thinking, us is trans people, trans-inclusive women, trans-inclusive feminists, trans-inclusive LGBTQ plus people. Are you hearing our stories, or are you hearing distortions via transphobic projections, Silence of the Lambs, etc.? And are you then hearing those stories, internalizing them, and using those to frame your narratives? Stories can show multiplicity of experience and resist stereotypes. And they can also share experience and demonstrate that we're not alone. So I guess this is all about the importance of stories and the question of framing those stories. So disclosure, as I was talking about, very much frames trans people as, let's go to that one, figures of ridicule, pity, and fear, until a more recent trans new wave where people get to tell their own stories. Let me just show you the trailer for disclosure.
I can't even tell you how many times I've been in public space, particularly early in my transition, when I would walk into a subway car and people would just burst into laughter. And I think people are been trained to have that reaction. According to a study from GLAAD, 80% of Americans don't actually personally know someone who is transgender. So most of the information that Americans get about who transgender people are, what our lives are and are about, comes from the media.
We've been around since there was footage. You just have to look for us.
Can we all just talk about D.W. Griffith for a minute? Not only is he incredibly racist, but he turned gender non-conforming people into the joke.
So it's like you can't have like queer trans people and blackness in the same space at the same time. So what's to say about my queer trans black ass?
They've died so many times they can't even count on camera.
I've been a prostitute, prostitute 1, prostitute 2, call girl, hooker.
The crying game created a ripple effect.
You are a trans person who existed, made people physically ill. Was the way in which my favorite movie as a child ended.
There are lots of ugly things about our history, but I think we have to know them.
I have been beaten. I have been thrown in jail for gay liberation, and you all treat me this way?
There is a one-word solution to almost all the problems in trans media. We just need more. And that way, the occasional clumsy representation wouldn't matter as much because it wouldn't be all that there is.
You see a fierceness that's coming up now. That's because we ain't got nothing to lose.
These are my sisters up here, but the struggle is real.
The ways in which trans people have been represented have suggested that we're mentally ill, that we don't exist. And yet here we are, and we've always been here.
So, disclosure, very important piece of, I think, very important document. Laverne Cox, very articulate, talking about those representations of the whole. It's what I was saying about people being left out of the debate. If people are talking about your community, surely the community should be talking about themselves and their own experiences. And I think something like disclosure redresses that very well. But obviously, those of us who watch anything will know that things have changed quite dramatically in the last, probably from 2015 onwards, 2014 onwards. And, we have these very high profile, very popular television series, such as Pose, Sense8, Sex Education, Heartstopper, all very high quality, very well written, and very inclusive forms of television. And we're in a period of what Eliza Steinbach has called a trans new wave. And what they really mean by that is that these are trans people telling their own stories, so that the kind of point of view and the lens is no longer distorted. Some examples here, I'm not going to go for give you lists and lists because that would just be silly, but I just, mentioned some examples of positive, well-known trans representations on film. Some of you will know some of my favorite films are kind of French films, Ma Vie en Rose, Tomboy, Petite Fille, looking at kind of preteen early gender non-conforming experience. Fantastic Woman, Sebastián Lelio's a Chilean film talking about discrimination faced by trans women when her partner dies. Then we've got a kind of new subgroup of history, sort of trans people documenting their own history. So Disclosure can fit into that. Also Framing Agnes, and another Netflix production, El Dorado, Everything the Nazis Hate, which looks at the experience of trans people during the early years of the Nazi regime. Again, I'm not going to read, but we can see that we're in this kind of, and I guess what I was interested in and what I would need to look more into was this kind of divergence between the kind of trans-hostile, right-wing and centrist UK media and then television, and how they're going in completely separate directions, which kind of gives me hope, particularly as a lot of these programs are very popular amongst young people who probably aren't reading a lot of the Daily Telegraph on a daily basis. But they will be watching Pose, they will be watching Tales of the City, they will be watching Sense8, or they should be, Star Trek. You know, these are massive shows. And they're kind of examples of what I've called integrated storytelling. So it's not like, oh, let's put the microscope on a trans person and let's dissect them. But trans people are part of the world, they're part of our communities, and they're going to be part of a list of characters. And I think that's a very effective way of, as Simon was saying, pushing back, telling different stories, countering that narrative. But again, we can see, similar to the rise of the transphobic hate, that this is kind of starting from 2014 onwards. And just some nice pictures that I happen to have in a different presentation, so I thought I'd put it there. Then I was looking for a slide for however, and this is some of my, and I know am I okay for time? I'm talking a lot, okay. I teach a module in gender sexuality in cinema in Portsmouth, and one of the resources I find incredibly useful is the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative. And the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative do these really broad studies. They have a whole team of people, and they look at data on inequality this is one study, inequality in 1,600 popular films, and they examine portrayals of gender, race, ethnicity, LGBTQ+, and disability from 2007 to 2022. And we've really got the data. They go through, they track it, and and obviously I give my students the work, and I'm not going to do it to you, but it is very, very interesting. Their methodology is to look at representations on screen and behind the camera across the 100 top grossing fictional films. So I've been talking about this kind of golden age and all of these things that are films and TV shows that are coming. When we actually look at the biggest hits and the highest grossing, we have actually very low data. And I'll just give you some examples. So these were some noteworthy points. The 100 top movies of 2022, only one speaking character was coded as gender non-binary. One. We're taking over the world, we're pushing our views down people's throats. One. No correlation with demographics. 2022, 2.1% of 4,169 speaking or named characters were LGBTQ+. 2.1%, again, no correlation with the demographic. Top grossing films. Whilst the highest number, this is kind of a sad one, whilst the highest number of transgender characters were observed in 2022, 4 of the 5 transgender characters in 2022 appeared in one movie. So there's only one movie that had some trans characters and then another film, which I don't know, which was a total of 5. So, you know, moral panic may be a moral panic, but actually in high grossing popular films, there's an underrepresentation. And then, of course, and I just made this point, streaming platforms are just that. So Netflix may have all these comments about how inclusive it is, but at the same time, it platformed Dave Chappelle's specials, Ricky Gervais's specials. But at the same time, it platformed Mae Martin's special, Mae Martin, who identifies as who's non-binary. And Mae Martin calls out Dave Chappelle and Ricky Gervais in their special SAP, which I really recommend. So we are also having trans hostile, even on platforms like Netflix. Okay, I can't, this is sort of my final little section. I can't finish the talk without a bit of self-promotion. Well, I can, but I'm going to. So we wrote a book. We edited a book called about Sense8 with my co-editor Rob Stone. And I just really wanted to, I'm not quite sure why I put this in, but I'm going to try and find a reason. I think what I wanted to do was to show an example of the potential of trans-inclusive storytelling when told by trans creatives, and in this case, Lana and Lily Wachowski. So I don't know how many of you know Sense8. I'll just do a very brief introduction. So it's a series that presents 8 strangers from different parts of the world who belong to a separate species called Homo sensorium, kind of idealized form of who we can be. They soon connect to form a cluster of Sense8 and discovered they're plugged into a form of radical empathy. Before this, I'll probably just show you this because it will make more sense.
Few know what it means to be reborn, a Sense8.
A what?
You saw her, but that's just the beginning.
I can feel you. You're not really here, are you?
You are no longer just you. You'll start to feel strange things. Anger and joy and pain, pleasure, without any reason. You have 7 other selves now. You can access each other's knowledge, language, skills. You will be hunted. There's no more time. You need to run.
I'm losing my mind.
No, it's just expanding.
It's a great line. I'm losing my mind. No, it's just expanding. And a lot of the series is really about a critique of the kind of binary ways we see our world. So the empathy that the characters share, they come together to kind of access each other's thoughts and minds and selves, propels the characters to cross barriers of space, gender, sexuality, and language to form new composite selves formed of 2s, 3s, or the whole cluster to combat physical or emotional enemies. So you could argue it's about community, it's about transnational connections, it's a critique of nationalism and very narrow binary identities. It can be argued that the series could have only been created by trans people, as the concept of trans philosophically, and we write quite a lot about that in the book, is harnessed to transcend unitary or binary identities and to create a collective identity. The tagline tells us, I am also a we. So it's kind of that utopian potential of trans in that sort of sense of connection and community. There they are. And I wanted to just end this with a single clip. Actually, I do have one other image, but I'm nearly there. And I was thinking, why do I want to show this clip? And I think it's so central in the power of community, LGBT identities, belonging to Stonewall, and the centrality of the T to the LGBTQ+. So this is a character, for those that haven't seen it, called Nomi. She is a trans computer hacker, and she's one of the cluster, and she's being hunted by the baddies who want to perform a lobotomy on her, which of course is very symbolic as well. And this is her talking about the importance of pride and why going to Pride is so important. Gay Pride really features in the series.
I've been thinking about my life and all of the mistakes that I've made. The ones that stay with me, the ones that I regret, are the ones that I made because of fear. For a long time, I was afraid to be who I am because I was taught by my parents that there's something wrong with someone like me. Something offensive, something you would avoid, maybe even pity. Something that you could never love. My mom, she's a fan of St. Thomas Aquinas. She calls pride a sin. And of all the venal and mortal sins, St. Thomas saw pride as the queen of the 7 deadlies. He saw it as the ultimate gateway sin that would turn you quickly into a sinaholic. But hating isn't a sin on that list. Neither is shame. I was afraid of this parade because I wanted so badly to be a part of it. So today, I'm marching for that part of me that was once too afraid to march. And for all the people who can't march. The people living lives like I did. Today I march to remember that I'm not just a me. I'm also a we. And we march with pride. So go fuck yourself, Aquinas. Hell yeah!
Step off the train at dawn, back in the place where...
So as Nomi says, we only need pride when others make us feel shame. So I think that was a very powerful, and the sort of the power of the collective. And hopefully more people will watch that than read the Daily Telegraph or watch GB News. Very finally, that was going to be my last slide. And then, of course, because I can't ever stop talking, I just wanted to add one, which was that yesterday I went to the Tate Modern exhibition, Women in Revolt, and I just saw one image, and I just thought I just have to end it with this. I'll just read you what. So this is by Rosie Martin, and the image there, and this is, and I've sort of titled this "What We Can Learn from Lesbian History." In these images, Martin wraps herself in bandages covered with a series of aggressive and homophobic words and phrases. In the smaller print, she attempts to break free of these metaphorical binds. Martin explains, the work was made in response to Clause 28 in the UK, a repressive piece of legislation, and used quotes from the debates in Parliament, as well as the response of my mother to my coming out as a lesbian. It's a personal and political response to the homophobia that was current at the time. And I looked at that and I thought, the person in the bandages now is a probably trans woman. The insults, the wrong, just a phase, predator, unnatural, makes my skin creep, pervert, disease, evil, sick. So, you know, gender critical lesbians, I can't tell them what to think, but I would just say, let's reflect on how people talked about us and think about how we talk about other people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. That was so thought-provoking, and I really enjoyed how you ended the talk with the note about community, note about empathy, note about how similar rhetorical tactics and media tactics have happened against marginalized peoples of all kinds, not only trans people at the moment. I thought when you were talking about the overwhelmingly negative media attention towards trans people and then counteracting it with these screen representations, I want to repeat this because I wrote down a quote from your talk. Trans identity is rendered real through screen mediations. I thought that was so beautifully said.
Thank you.
And I also thought that another statistic that I recently read was that in 23, an LGBTQ rights survey was conducted again across 30 different countries. And actually this survey found that 77% of Brits agreed that trans people should be protected from discrimination. And I wonder, like, that is a statistic that is kind of against this idea that everybody in the UK or the majority of people are transphobic. It doesn't seem quite true. So yeah, just wondering how much this media attention plays also into the notion that there is transphobia all around us, when that may not necessarily always be the case. However, next we will have time for questions, a luxurious 45-50 minutes. Before we begin, let me just say a few words of housekeeping. Our priority is, of course, to keep this conversation respectful and safe, in particular to our queer, trans, and gender diverse participants. So please keep that in mind. And in the spirit of Deborah's talk, let's also keep the conversation at the issues, not on personal, person-oriented critiques or personal attacks, right? I thought that was a really good point, and I think that, you know, this is exactly what we should be doing, despite other people maybe not always complying with that same principle. And a reminder, people in the room as well as online, you can go on Slido, slido.com, use the hashtag translove, post your questions anonymously, and people in the room, you can also just raise your hand and ask questions, and Simon will be bringing the microphone to you. Well, while we have a few questions on Slido, but I thought that as a kind of a warm-up question, and I know this because we exchanged a few emails about the reception of your article, The Tale of Two Feminisms. Would you like to say a few words about how this analysis that you now condensed to us in this talk was received?
Yeah, something I did think about this. I gave a talk about the reception of the article as well. And one of the things that it's kind of obvious, but that if you write about the culture war, you become part of the culture war. So if you want to write about these issues, you kind of have to be prepared for a lot of love and a lot of hate. On the negative side, it was an open access article. And on one level, it's really good that you can, you know, as you said, this sense of we're trying to be public intellectuals. It was found by Mumsnet. They read it with rigor that I only wish my students would read, some work, looking at paragraphs, dissecting it, what it means. But it was very, very hostile. And it was, you know, and I happened to be on Mumsnet, don't shoot me, from a legacy, because I am a mum, but I was a mum with a little person. And I would go on like, oh, how do you breastfeed? Or how do you do this? Or what's this? So it was the days before it became a kind of hive of transphobia. So I had an old account and I just found that they were talking about it. And the comments were really negative, like, you know, what even is a film professor and how ridiculous. You think you can shut us up? Sorry, Deborah, but that's not going to happen. And it was very like, and then a lot of the comments were like, this is just really bad work. This is this is rubbish. It hasn't been peer reviewed. And annoyingly, I couldn't resist as a lurker. I just went, oh, hello, yes, it has been peer reviewed, actually. It had two reviews that were very rigorous and changes were made. And then it was like, oh, are you here? And it's like, well, come and debate with us, talk with us. And it was like, come on, bring it on. And I just didn't. And I think I said something like, look, I can't really debate when you're attacking me completely. If it was a forum for an open debate, I would discuss with you. So there was that. And a lot of hostility on Twitter when Kathleen Stock also tweeted about the article. So there was a lot of very negative, very hostile. And you think you're tough. I think I'm quite tough. But and I'm not going to plead that, oh, I was discriminated against and poor me. But obviously it does really affect you. So you have to think about, if you want to write about these things, to be prepared for a lot of hostility. And I couldn't look at Twitter before bed, for example, because it was like, the pylon is a scary thing. So I have experienced the pylon. By the same token, quite a lot of trans people wrote to me. A parent of a trans child wrote to me. Someone from New Zealand wrote to me. This very anti-trans Posey Parker, I can't remember her real name, Kelly J something. Anyway, she was going to New Zealand. Someone wrote to me and said, she's coming, all my group thinks she's great. I've just read your article. Thank you so much. It's really helped me understand the issues. So it did reach people in a way that nothing I've ever written has. So, and every time I was getting the kind of pile-on, I was thinking, this is nothing compared to what trans people are getting. So I never questioned that I should have written it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Deborah.
Yeah.
I think it's really brave, and that's exactly what we need, the courage to engage with the content of the arguments,
but I
even
would,
when it comes at a
but I
personal
would,
cost.
say to younger academics or less, it shouldn't be ageist, but that line, if you write about the culture wars, you can become part of the culture wars and be prepared for that hostility. And I totally understand a lot of people don't want to say what they think, they don't want to get involved.
Agreed, yes. Now, I thought that we could take a couple of questions from the room, then take a couple of questions from online.
Speak close to the microphone, please.
Okay, sorry. Hi. First of all, as someone who researches in the social media version of this area, this was brilliant and enlightening, and I really appreciate you coming to speak.
Thank you.
I guess my question was specifically from your point of view and your experience. I often find there is especially in online young people spaces, around film media, around trans representation, there is often this desire for the trans person that is on the screen needs to be perfect. The terminology needs to be perfect. There cannot be a language divide. Like, if there is an older trans person on the screen that is using language that a younger trans person might think is out of date, or it's not exactly how they experience their transness, it can often create a divide and a mass exodus from content that's actually still very good. And I think my question is, how do we nurture that group of people to embrace that second bit, while also, because the kind of underlie here is, if they don't find a consensus, this third group that it's like, this media's terrible, it's brainwashing our children, I hope this isn't being transcribed because that's not a word. How do we nurture that divide in between to still have critical conversations about how we appear in media, but also how we have to accept that sometimes it doesn't need to be perfect to be right?
I think that's a really excellent point, and I think part of the answer would be making points like that. I often think about the development of queer theory and the fact that people like Judith Butler, one of the key ideas, we don't police identity, we don't police sexuality, we move away from the purism. And I think intent is everything. And I think a lot of trans people, trans inclusive people, I don't even want to use the word forgiving, but you can sense the at intent of how people are talking. People will not use a terminology. And then if you say to someone, actually, I don't use that terminology, I use this, and then they respect that, fine. If they deliberately carry on using terminology that you don't want to use. So it's just about respect, intent. It's complicated, but it's really not that complicated as well. And I also I think about the Jen Richards comment in Disclosure when she says, we just need more. We just need more representation. People have to be allowed to be flawed. It's an impossible ideal. You know, a lot of the new queer cinema films had some very flawed characters, but they were very significant at the time because it was like, well, we don't want to be tolerated and accepted. There was a Q attitude. It's like, let's just live our lives and be flawed. So I completely agree with you. But perhaps it's, you know, if a community feels under siege, they go on the attack. And I think it's about, you know, we've said this at events that we've held, and you know, there was one event I went on and there was some trans people had a really misogynistic placard, really insulting. And you sort of want to, you don't want to be kind of the older statesman, but you just want to go up to the young people and just say, do you realize the damage you're doing by, I'm going into a different subject now, but one is not having that respectful debate and also looking at intent. So I don't have your answer, but I think more of us that are just saying these things, I think it's framing a discussion. Purism is very dangerous by any group. You know, there's an infighting now with some of the trans people because some of the gender criticals, because some of them talked about Brianna Jai as she. And so there's this purism within that community saying purism is dangerous. I really believe that. We have to be able to explore and develop and expand our minds. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Here's another question.
The microphone close to your mouth, please.
Hi, just a very quick question. Is there a UK media outlet or a newspaper, a TV program that has done some work that you think is not that bad? Thank you.
I mean, the community newspaper Pink News is very trans inclusive. The Guardian is a platform, like Netflix is a platform. You will have some very inclusive writers writing for The Guardian with some brilliant articles. You will have some gender critical writers writing for The Guardian. So The Guardian depends who's writing. Novara Media, don't know if you follow Novara Media. They are have got a number of they're very leftist, very trans inclusive. So yeah, that will come. I don't know. Other people in the room will know other outlets. Channel 4 News, probably more trans inclusive.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, and if you know of any more, let me know as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, for one, I know that in London there is a very flourishing trans, non-binary, queer performance art scene, which gives you also the sense of live community. But maybe it's time to take a couple of questions from Slido. So here is, I'm just going in the order that they came in. A question, why are you calling trans exclusionary people feminists? I don't mind calling them gender critical, but there is no feminism without trans inclusion.
Yeah, it's a good question. I go with a self-ID. I'm not weighing into that. They call themselves trans, gender critical feminists. It's not a position I agree with. And I've read quite a bit where people are saying, exactly making that point, and there are plenty of people that have made that point. So it's not so much that I'm calling them feminists, I'm saying how they identify. But yeah, I'm aware of the discussion.
Yeah, I think that there have been quite a few academics who have argued that, like you said, feminism has been kind of co-opted in that regard. Okay, we have a bit of a funny, but perhaps a completely relevant question from Slido. Do you think there could be any truth in the notion that, quote unquote, some transphobic people are actually suppressing their own gender identity?
I'd have to have them in therapy to, but it is interesting that there have been some high-profile gender-critical, inverted commas, feminists who have said, if the trans, again, inverted commas, ideology was dominant when I was growing up, Kathleen Stocker said this, I could well have become trans. So it's almost like, thank God I escaped. If this ideology had been there. So you could argue that there is a fear. I've heard other people say that if that was the dominant belief at the time, they wouldn't have been lesbians, they would have just been trans men. So I don't know the answer, but I know some gender critical people have said that.
Yeah, I think it's a fair note that the environment that we live in and the words that we are able to use that are available to us will impact our identity and how we move through this world. Questions from the room again?
Speak closely to the microphone, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. I've been trying to work out how to frame it as a question. So it's more, I'm interested in the role of the institution and where it seems to dissolve and disappear and then become in prominence. And I'm interested in how, using that term, gender critical feminists have, for argument's sake, I'm going to weaponize an institution, for example, complaints processes, reporting, etc., and how that changes a dynamic in a discussion and a debate where the institution is sort of brought into being and then fades away when we're trying to talk about rights and protections. And I know this may or may not be your area, but I wondered what your thoughts were about how we consider the institution as we continue with this discussion and these debates.
How we, sorry, I didn't know
how we consider the institution, like where is its prominence?
In this case, you're talking about university.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting question, and I would need to look into it a lot more. Funnily enough, I wrote to our dean at the university, and I just said, have we revised some of our policies in the light of the recent case of, because I think there is, and I didn't get it, hasn't replied to me yet, but you know, we have these bold statements of EDI, and then we have the kind of the way that the government is kind of weaponizing free speech and trying to put all these kind of constraints on the university, almost provocatively to invite people. I always think there's a difference between no platforming and who you choose to invite, but there's almost like this invitation to provocatively invite people that you know students are going to protest against, and then how the institution manages that is complex. I know we had a case, without going into any details, I've heard of a case where a prominent gender critical person, I'm going to say, was invited to the university to give a talk. There were protests. And there was an issue, I think, this is secondhand, that person hadn't gone through the correct channels to make sure that invitation was. So I think universities just need to be very careful about who's being invited, what security is in place, what's a genuine invitation, what's a provocation. Because I think traps are being laid for universities all the time, and how universities avoid those traps. So you know, if the case of that I gave today, and name's just gone, you know, you set up a gender critical network and then there's complaints about it. What does the university do? In the light of this case, probably something different. I don't actually have the answer, but I think it's something that that universities need to grapple with. Sometimes, I was talking about this with my brother on the way here, sometimes I think there's always this battle between fighting for your rights and your cause and casting a lot of media spotlight on things. And sometimes I think if a provocative speaker has been invited,
maybe don't say anything. Maybe have them in a room with 10 people. Maybe don't protest. Maybe don't fall into the trap. Is that cowardly, or is that not? Is that taking the media spotlight away from them? Because you know that the Daily Mail is going to write a report the next day. But that's just strategy. That's not. So it's a really, really good question that I think requires a lot of research. But I don't have the answer.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point in terms of, as a digital media scholar, I know that there have been studies around like alt-right strategies in inciting conflict. So often these kinds of events are organized precisely to attract protest and conflict in order to make the same arguments again and kind of inflame that, that circular sort of logic, yeah, which is why perhaps
But I
these
think,
kinds of
and I
events
think more
are-
and more universities are asking for a protocol about how who's being invited, why, how it's going to be managed. I think they're very attuned to it, and they are under attack. So it's a very delicate position for the institution to be in.
I saw a couple of hands up. I'm not sure who was first. Here or here? Okay, yes.
Thank you. Just on a really sort of cynical note, this is more of a point than a question. I don't know if you looked into this. It might have come out after your article was published, but when REF, I think, came in 2022, I think Sussex got in the region of about 2 to 3 million as kind of grants and beneficiaries from that. But I think it's in the region of about 500,000 of that went explicitly to the philosophy department under the guise of Kathleen Stock's public engagement. So I think there's
That's
a lot of,
interesting.
this is information in the public domain,
Yeah.
but I think there's a lot of monetary value coming from gender critical academics. You can see the numbers broken down, and I think that's a huge reason as to why universities are being very tentative about this. And as you pointed out with all the media coverage, it's getting them so much traction if they're seen to be defending figures like her.
But they also get an awful lot of money from students, and students will not want to attend institutions that are publicly too aligned with gender critical thinking. So it's but I mean, this, as you say, it's a cynical mandatory point, and it's a good point, but they're also very aware of students as the primary income and keeping them on side. You know, I like to think that human rights shouldn't be a trend, but, you know.
That was 2. Shall we again take a couple from Slido and then come to you, okay? Yes. So a question from Slido. Maybe this is more like a clarifying question. Someone says, it sounded at one point like you did not consider gender critical to be inherently transphobic. Is that correct?
No, it's not correct.
It's incorrect.
It's
yeah.
incorrect. I'm trying to be careful in the light of some of the things you're saying, because I don't want a tribunal where someone says, I said. But so what I would prefer to do is to look at their words and their statements, which I did in one case, which was transphobic. And where I can see words and statements that are transphobic, I will happily call them transphobic. But I'm very careful, for the reasons we've said, to not call someone transphobic, even if privately I believe they are.
Thanks for that clarification. Another question from Slido. The left-wing feminists are happy to appear on right-wing outlets, suggests the importance they place on this topic. Why is it that important to them?
Who's the them? The right-wing outlets or the feminists?
I assume the left-wing feminists, but I'm sure you can take the question as you wish.
I mean, I guess from their point of view, a platform with a wide audience is an opportunity to share ideas. I think there's a victim status going on. I think people are casting themselves as victims, and they're getting status through being victims. I find it very troubling that it's the opposite of intersectionality. Because if a platform, let's just talk about GB News, if a platform is anti-vax, overtly anti-immigrant, anti any kind of left-wing politics or anti any kind of institutional attempts to tackle racism, and they appear on that platform, I find that very troubling, because if you do have an approach of intersectionality, you can't ignore the platform. So I think it's a mistake. And that's where I would question some of these people's identification as feminist, left-wing, lesbians on a platform that is homophobic and is anti-immigrant and is anti-left-wing.
Yeah, there was an earlier comment on Slido comparing the media coverage on trans people with the coverage of migrants.
Yeah,
pointing out that a similar othering, dehumanizing discourse is.
And I think that's a really good point. And I think the anti-intersectionality thing is this is a community of people who've been scapegoated by right-wing government, in my opinion, to embrace the culture wars as a way to hide from their own errors on Brexit, on immigration, on cost of living, on economy, on all sorts of things. And they've said very overtly, Lee Anderson, we want to flame the fans of the culture wars. And the gender critical people are being used as pawns in that. And trans people are being used as pawns of the government, the main discourse. It is scapegoating, and it as with my immigrants and asylum seekers. And I think it needs to stop.
Yeah. Okay, let's get back to the room.
Hi, yes, thanks for your talk. Before I lived here, I lived for quite a while in the American South, and I was involved in some conversations between so-called conservative feminists versus more left-wing feminists, though I'm not sure if those are the terms that either group would use. And one thing that really strikes me as a big difference between that and my experiences in the UK is that when I was in the States, those conversations were had on both sides by women of all ages. Whereas here, I think there's way more of an age divide. Whereas like women my age and younger, I haven't really heard voices on the gender critical side. And I wonder how that has an impact on the media, because older voices are more likely to be found in journalism and younger voices, in the screen.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Of course, gender critical people would say, oh, they're just too scared to say what they really think. And however, I think your finding is correct. I think most people with gender critical views are over a certain age, which of course doesn't mean all older women have those views. And I think, what my talk was, was trying to do, which you've kind of clarified very well, is that a lot of these kind of very popular media shows, the Star Treks, the not so much Pose, what's the other one? I've just forgotten the name, with the school and the young people, and Heartstopper, thank you, and Sex Education. It's generally a younger demographic who are watching them. So I don't think I don't think they have a chance of capturing them, as it were. I think you're absolutely right, yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. This is a bit of a personal question, perhaps. In a context in which we sometimes find ourselves with weird bedmates, like gender critical scholars, that we have to navigate in our professional and personal environment.
Yeah.
What is your position? Would you collaborate with them in projects to try and, push trans-exclusive positions into the agenda, or would you flat out refuse to? I'm asking from myself, to be honest.
Yeah. And what's your answer? That's unfair.
I do try to be present in the spaces to push the debate towards positions that I think defend human rights. because I believe that complete segregation between, gender critical scholars and trans inclusive scholars does not foster the appropriate conversations, and does lead to the media framing the debate in these terms. That said, this at an ethical level creates a lot of conflict. So I wanted to know how you deal with it. If it's a difficult question, feel free not to ask.
I mean, it's, as you were saying, it's not something I've ever encountered. So it's not an ethical question I've ever been confronted with. I think I would go back to when I presented this, I would go back to, I'd first have to talk about what we're going to talk about. I'd first have to look at what maybe I would be prepared to have discussions about discussions before saying, yep, let's get you in, we want this person, we want that person. I mean, I do think analogies can be dangerous, but I think humans think in analogous terms. And I think if someone said, well, I really believe in eugenics, and I really believe that certain ethnicities have a lower IQ, I'm not going to work with them. I'm just not. So if someone framed a trans person as predatory or dangerous, I don't think I could.
Thank you.
And that's it. When does your inclusiveness have to rest on other people's exclusionary behaviour?
That's a really good point. Thank you.
Yeah.
We have more questions online. Shall we go back to online?
Can I go to the toilet soon?
I
just need
Are
a
you
wee.
ready for a
I can
bit
do
more
one more.
grilling?
Okay.
A few more?
Go on.
Okay. So people are thanking you
Thank
for
you.
a great talk
you.
online. This follows up from the previous question, so I'll just shoot. How would you advise we begin to have the talks about the talks that you spoke about in this talk? Can you say more about it?
I'm not necessarily looking for talks about talks. I think I'd be more interested in talks about talks with students, because I'm a different person to when I'm having a polemic point of view in a discussion, and when I've had a group of students in front of me who have said some very transphobic things. And with those people, I would have talks about talks, because I'm an educator, I'm in a role, I'm playing partners. I can't insult them, I don't want to insult them. I want to explore where their ideas come from, and I want to explore why they think that and how they think that. The first time it took me by surprise, and I didn't deal with it very well. As in, I didn't insult them, but I just stepped back. So I think I would have talks about talks in my role as a lecturer, but in my personal academia and activism, I'm not particularly looking for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess it's, I took this question to maybe refer to what you mentioned in the talk about the terms of speaking, right? That when other people are engaging in personal attacks, and you would like to engage with the issues, it might be difficult to.
I mean, there's behaviours in terms of behaviours in discussion, and insults and death threats and violence are not appropriate or acceptable ever. So I would have talks about that and processes, but actual belief, I don't know. I need to think about that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry.
I'll have another question from online, and then I think there's time.
Question from Slido, then one more from the audience.
Sounds great. Okay, so there's a question. Thank you for your talk that takes the existence of those of us who are trans and non-binary as a fact. I wanted to ask, who do you think is the most important to hear what you are saying? Who do you feel this talk is for?
That's a really good question. It's for whoever wants to listen to it. I guess it is as a sort of act of solidarity with trans and non-binary people to sort of say, look, we don't all think like this. And it's I know the word ally as being discussed about how appropriate it is, but I see it as a kind of actor, as an ally to sort of say, but I'm also, I have skin in the game, and I guess it's for me. I got fed up with being told that as a feminist and lesbian, trans people were impacting me and making me feel less safe, when that's not my experience at all. So it's also pushing back on what people are telling me is my experience. And I guess it's trying to, I guess it's for a wider audience to counter that one-tone narrative that I felt was being given in the media. So it's like any of us, when we write things, we want to be read. So whoever reads it and kind of maybe changes their mind about something or becomes more informed.
Yeah, we have some people on Slido commenting who are kind of genuinely grappling with these two feminisms.
Yeah, it's definitely for them.
So you are, in fact, speaking also to people who are actually struggling and trying to make sense of.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm sorry, we did not get to all of the questions on Slido, but I would like for all of the participants to know that we do read the questions and we will take note of all of them, and we'll also forward them to Deborah.
Okay, thank you.
But we have one more question in the audience.
I've got a loud voice. I'll try not to. I was just going to ask if you had any general tips for how you manage to, I guess, educate or inform people who are, like you say, on the fence, but perhaps might look at some gender critical views and on the surface think, oh, those sound reasonable. How you manage to sort of, I guess, advise those people without seeming that you're almost really militant and going into a long lecture, because obviously talks like this are so fantastic because you can get into the details, but you almost want to know how you can say on the surface, how to sort of, debunk.
Well, one of the attacks that gender critical people give of trans inclusive people is that we're not evidence-based. So be evidence-based. I mean, I guess one of the approach I tried to do in the article was to say, okay, so let's look at trans women in prisons. Let's look at what the facts are. So I would go to I've got a friend in Portsmouth who does freedom of information for hospitals, a trans woman. She's found that there wasn't a single complaint about trans women being in mixed wards. So evidence, facts, based, one case of one trans person can dominate the news. We can do that with any community. We know that. Every community has people who you can present in a negative light. So facts. And the other thing is, they've done such a great job, the media creators. I just say watch Pose. Watch Pose. Watch Disclosure. Watch Sex Education. Because they're the skilled craftspeople who can show people's lived experience, the use of melodrama sometimes, the emotions, I would probably have a list of things to watch, not necessarily kind of very worthy, but there's a lot of kind of really popular, sentimental, gushy, lovely stuff that it will melt your hard heart, basically.
Okay, thank you so much,
you.
Deborah. Please
you very
join
much.
me in thanking her.
Thank you.
And please stay tuned for upcoming trans inclusive seminar events. Thank you.